Layer stamping white flowers can be challenging. Learn tips to stamping enough of a shadow to add structure and contrast to these white orchids. And for a bit of fun, I'll create a Dexter themed card using red paint for blood spatter. Here I have the Altenew Spotted Orchid Stamp, Die, and Mask Bundle. As always, all of the products used in this video will be linked in the description below, as well as a link to my blog post. This is part of a blog hop, so be sure to follow the link to the blog post to enter to win a gift card to shop Altenew. Of course, while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe. Opening up the trifold here, you can see lots of inspiration. What I was thinking I would go for is 2 blooms and a stem like you see there on the bottom. But the first thing that I thought of when I saw this stamp set was the episode of Dexter where Hannah gave him a white orchid that looked like it had been spattered with blood. So that's where the inspiration from this card came from. Now, of course, I don't have a Dexter stamp set, so I pulled out the fine alphabet dies in order to create that sentiment. I'm going to start off with Morning Frost. Now, I did test this a couple times, and when I stamped Morning Frost directly onto the paper, it was too dark. So again, I'm trying to go for a white orchid look with some red spatters on it. So I'm going to do some second generation stamping. If you're not familiar with second generation stamping, basically you ink up your stamp it off on a scrap piece of paper like you just saw me do, and then you stamp it again a second time on the actual cardstock that you're going to be using, or the card front. Here you can see that it has a really mottled look because I removed some of the ink on that first stamping on the scratch paper. So this is called second generation stamping. I'm going to do that again with the second layer of the stamp. So when you look at this stamp set, there is a completely solid image. I skipped that image completely, again, because I want this to be a white flower. I started with the second layer. Now this is the third layer. So for the third layer, I'm going to use limestone ink, and I'll continue with the second generation stamping. So I've stamped it off on a scratch piece of paper, and now I'm going to stamp it on my actual cardstock here. So this is really kind of like a ghosty kind of image. It's not a clear stamping by any means, and that's not necessarily what I'm going for. I'm not going for a really solid image because, again, I just want kind of the hint of those shadows. Now this time, instead of stamping it off onto a scratch piece of cardstock, I decided to see what it would look like if I just used my microfiber cloth to take off some of the ink. And when you do this, so this is a second option for you, when you do this, this is going to add even more texture to the stamped image. You can kind of see that grainy appearance, which is the towel fibers. So I'll do that for the second image as well. And these look very similar, although you get a little bit more of a solid image using the microfiber cloth with that grainy texture. So this is now moving on to layer 4, which for us is only the third thing that we've stamped, remember, because we skipped the first layer of this stamp set. So I've inked this up with limestone ink. I'll go ahead and stamp that down, and it's not quite dark enough. I want to see a little bit more depth in the center of the flower. So now I'm going to stamp it again in Polar Bear. This is a super light desaturated blue, and it's just going to add a little bit more interest to the center of my flower. This time when I stamp it on this flower, I'm going to stamp just the Polar Bear, and you're going to see how much lighter this is. So the center of this flower is not nearly as dark. There's not as much shadow in the center. I wanted to show you a few different variations. Now here I have the Red Sunset watercolor pan, and this is from the Altenew 24 pan artist watercolor set. I added a drop of water into the pan and let it sit for a little bit. So I wanted the paint to be really thick because blood isn't super liquidy. So I wanted it to have that blood spatter appearance. So I'm going to flick that on, and then I'll set these aside to dry. As we move on to our second set of flowers, I wanted just one more variation of color here. Again, we'll skip the first layer of the stamp set, starting with layer number 2. I'm going to ink that up with Polar Bear ink, stamp off some of the ink, and put the second generation inking on my cardstock. This is going to be super light. In fact, you guys can barely see it. I like how light this is, so I'm going to continue with this. For the third stamp, I'm going to use limestone, and I'll do the second generation with this as well. So we'll stamp it off. I wanted to make sure I got it all off on that corner, and then we'll add a little bit more depth to this. So now we have one layer that's the polar blue, one layer that's limestone, and then for the third layer, which is the fourth stamp, we're going to add limestone again. I was really liking the bluish undertones of the shadows, and so after stamping it in limestone, I did the same stamp set with a touch of Misty Morning, and I did second generation stamping with this as well. So I'm just going to kind of take a little bit of that off with the microfiber cloth and then stamp that down. This is where I stopped on the first set of cards. With this one, I decided to do this really detailed layer. This is the last stamp that goes with this set, and it's more of a stippled appearance. I wanted to make sure that I got the center of the flower quite dark, so what I'm doing is I'm just tearing up some pieces of Post-it note tape, and I'm going to mask the stamp itself. I felt like that would be a lot easier to actually mask the stamp rather than my cardstock, and I'll ink up the center with pure graphite. Now, if you do this, do make sure that you remove your Post-it notes before you stamp this on your project. Otherwise, you'll transfer all of that ink over. So you can see I have just the very center of the flower inked up. I'll stamp that down, and that's going to give me a nice dark center. I wanted to make sure I had high contrast somewhere on this flower. Even though it's a white flower, you should have somewhat of a dark center. And then for the full stamp, I'll use Silverstone, which is a light gray ink, to add that bit of stippling effect, and I think that just takes these flowers to the next level. It gives it that contrast that the first set of flowers was lacking. I went ahead and spattered these off screen, and here's a comparison. On the left is the first set of flowers that we did, and then on the right is where we added in the polar bear blue. Now, I really do like the ones on the left, and I think if I had added that last stamp and that dark center to those would have looked great, and those actually look a little bit more white than the blue toned flowers I ended up using on my card, and that's why I left both of these options in there for you so that you could see both versions. So here I went ahead and die cut my letters, and I need to draw in a stem for these flowers. So I've just put 2 of them on the card, and I'm going to draw a really simple stem. I don't need much, especially for the second flower up top. I really just need that little bit where it connects to the flower. Now that I have the stem somewhat mapped out, I'll go ahead and color these with frayed leaf artist marker, and I'm using the Greenfield set, so that's frayed leaf, forest glades, and evergreen. I use those same ink pads in order to stamp the leaves. I did those off screen because they're really easy to do and it's pretty standard stamping. For the stem, I'm just using a flicking motion and putting in a little bit of details with the very tip of the marker. This isn't an outline stamp, so I don't need to draw an outline to this stem at all. I really just need to color it in and just do a super basic stem. So here I'm just looking at the arrangement with my leaves and kind of seeing where I wanted things. I felt like the Dexter sentiment definitely needed to be grounded, so I went ahead and printed up a sub-sentiment on my printer that read, "Returns in 2021. That's going to help to ground those red letters. Here I decided I needed to extend that stem a little bit, so I'm using the same process to just add a little bit more stem. I had so much fun creating this themed card and experimenting with my inks to see how I could get them light enough to create the look and feel of white layer stamping. It's all about experimenting with your products. If you learned something new or you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. And after I created this card, I reached out to the Altenew team to see if they could create a really light set of inks specifically for white layer stamping. So I hope that that is something that they do one day. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you soon with more inspiration.